Thanks so much, Steve. I guess I don't need to introduce myself because he did it for me. Thanks so much for having me. This is a really interesting topic for me, both in terms of my past experience working at Avenue A, which was ultimately Razorfish, and then working in a trading desk, and then certainly from a kind of more intellectual and theoretical standpoint in my work at Forrester. I do talk to marketers every day that are struggling with this problem of how to make sense of kind of data overload, and specifically within the context of making their marketing programs work better. So I wanted to kind of pick the brains of these guys around a couple key topics. Third-party data is kind of an obvious one. First-party data, very interesting one. Also really interested in this concept of the data management platform, which is kind of the new hot acronym. So I want to talk about that. And then if we have time, I'm also very interested in the concept of how we are verifying this data. How are we understanding if we're getting the data that we think that we are, and how do we think about that? So maybe if you guys could just take a second to introduce yourselves, that'd be helpful. Stuart?
Sure. My name's Stuart Pratt. I'm a Director of Analytics for the New York office of Sapient Nitro.
Hi, I'm Jason Lay. I'm the National Practice Lead for Consumer Insights at Razorfish.
Hi, I'm Toby Evers. I'm the VP of Business Intelligence and Insights for Morpheus Media.
Eugene Becker. I'm the Global Head of Analytics for Xaxis, which is Group M's audience buying platform.
I'm Emily Scott, and I'm Director of Marketing at Kayak.
I just want to note, not on purpose, but it turns out we have a lot of current and former Avenue A and Razorfish types on this panel. What does that say about Avenue A and Razorfish? Go team. Very excited about that. All right, so guys, let's start by talking about third-party data. There's just been this explosion of third-party data providers in the last 3 years or so. You have the kind of young upstarts, the Blue Kais, the Xlates, the Quantcasts, and then you have very traditional companies like Axiom, Experian, Polk getting into this space. And amidst all of this, you have a tremendous amount of marketer interest in being able to target audiences. We have so much data around this. One of marketers' biggest concerns when we talk to them is, how do I target better? How do I find my valuable audiences online more easily? How do I reduce waste? So when you're looking at the third-party data targeting space, what's happening at all of your agencies and Emily inside of your organization? And that's really for any of you guys. Oh, and incidentally, side note, very interesting to me that we have a lot of analytics folks. I think that's a good sign. I mean, I think in the early days of a lot of this stuff, it was really just kind of on the shoulders of the media planner and buyer to figure all this stuff out and make sense of the sort of range of third-party data providers that were available. And then if you look at this panel, we're very heavily represented by analytics folks. So I think it's very interesting. Take it.
So Xaxis is an audience buying platform, so obviously we have relationships with all the data providers out there, major and minor. Audience buying is what we do, so we are familiar with all of the sources of audience data. We have business rules for how we buy the data. We have priorities across different data partners. We know what data to buy, what data not to buy, depending upon the objectives of the campaign. So from our perspective, it's a very dynamic and fast-changing sector, but we have a pretty good approach to doing this.
I mean, so you said you have rules around how to use it. You said you know what to buy and what not to buy. Can we pick some of that apart a little bit so folks get a better sense of what that really means? Like, what kinds of rules are you putting around this stuff? When it depends on the business objective, what does that mean? So
we've categorized data into maybe 5 or 6 different buckets. And these buckets have different priorities. So first we max out the first bucket of data, which is typically customer data. So the customer data we online. Right. We'd max it out first. Then we'd move on to retargeting. Then we move on to other types of third-party data based on that. For each of those buckets, there are different business rules. So we know that we can bid more for different types of users. We know that we can afford to serve a higher frequency for different types of users. So we've mapped a number of strategies to different data types. And that's really the DNA of what Xaxis does.
So, Eugene, is it different data types or different data providers? I mean, do you find that behavioral targeting is behavioral targeting, or in-market targeting is in-market targeting, or you're always finding yourself going to Blue Kai for that stuff?
Well, no, it's really data type. So, for example, the key to looking at data is the degree of demonstrated intent. So search retargeting typically has built in a higher degree of intent than like an intender segment. So if you searched for shoes, you're more likely to buy them than if you're in a site looking at shoe reviews. And if you look at kind of model data or projected data, so if you build a model of lookalike people who have bought shoes in the past, that tends to be looser. So we look at different data types, and within each one of those data types, we obviously prioritize different relationships with different vendors based on the commercial terms.
So for somebody else, does the data lift justify the cost? I mean, are you using this stuff for direct response campaigns? Are you just happy having, or do you just have happy brand advertisers that can finally do things more effectively?
Yeah, I would say it's not always. For many of our clients, what we've been finding a lot is in the direct response space. A lot of the strategies you might like to think of and like to use, ultimately, we have a number of clients in really the direct response space. They do the same thing on TV where they're actually more effective and more efficient buying mass bulk online than doing behaviorally targeted advertising.
Wait, so you're saying spray and pray works better?
For some direct response marketers.
Some hard truth today.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is like, take a look at Netflix. I mean, how often do you see Netflix advertising in premium spaces? The reality of their approach is that, they buy at 75-cent CPMs, they spray it everywhere, and they go hardcore just to try to do what they can to drive net response. There are some direct response marketing campaigns that's efficient, much more efficient than trying to pay, 800% premiums for, geo-targeted advertising, because your audience is on, during the prime marketing hours of, when soaps are on, like a couple of our clients. But big deal, the geo-targeting, and the day parting, costs them, 5-7x of what the standard CPM charges are. So they're better off just running all day long.
All right, so that's a whole thorny issue around pricing. But Emily, I mean, you're our marketer, and you're actually a direct response marketer.
Yeah,
so
we do experiment with using third-party data. We use a lot of first-party data as well. And I think that, from looking at the process, I think for me, one of the first questions is, what am I trying to achieve? Can I achieve that with the data that I have? If I can't achieve it with the data that I have, then where do I look next? Who else might be able to provide that data? And so I think that's the approach that we take to then looking at different partners is, whether it's an audience or contextually relevant data. And I think that leads into the price conversation as well, because I think, audience buying obviously has become huge, but at the same time, looking at contextual indicators, which is another source of data, sometimes comes more cheaply. And so you might be able to still use a third-party data source. It might not be the one that comes on the PowerPoint slide and explaining how to use third-party data, but it actually can be more cost-effective. And I think the only way to find that out is to really plug it in. We work closely with MediaMath as our DSP. They guide us quite a bit, but help us to set up those test plans, and it's in the numbers. It's what is the lift in response rate, what is the change in cost, and do the metrics prove out?
I think that's a critical point. What ties the three sort of answers together so far is a need to have a discipline around testing, right? So there's not, at least in my experience with our clients, we're out of silver bullets, right? Big data is something that is of the moment, and everybody's talking about it, but gaining the technology and the techniques to leverage big data isn't going to solve all of your problems. You have to have a disciplined approach around thinking about what your goals and objectives are, planning tactics against that, throwing that into the marketplace, seeing what the results are, and using those results, actually using the results. This is where a lot of people fail, to change your behavior for next time.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. So let's talk about results for a second. I mean, we have so many bad habits as an industry that we've had for 15 years, where we still have a lot of marketers relying on things like click-through rate or buying on a CPC basis or optimizing, even to just simply CPA, which in some cases can be fine, and that's acceptable if your goal is volume. But with something like a return on ad spend metric, for example, if you're using maybe a slightly higher funnel kind of data overlay, where it's about getting in front of the right people, maybe they're not in market at that moment, but they're the right people, do you find that it can justify the cost from a value standpoint?
I think only if you're getting them in the right part of their path to conversion, because you have to
Sure.
look at that a lot deeper than you do with getting in front of the right audience. Your right audience may be the right audience, but if they're not in that path to actually buy or convert at that particular moment, then you're not going to capture them at all. And you could spend tons of money on that particular customer only to get in front of their face and have them walk away because they're not in that cycle.
Now, what would be really neat would be if somebody, and if anyone raised your hand, this would be awesome. If somebody was doing kind of full funnel targeting, like at the user level. Okay, Eugene's like, yes, I am. Yeah. Let's talk about it.
It's depends upon whether it's at the user level or not, but we have aligned our objectives to different types of data. So if you need to target broad enough, right, you're going to have a different type of a model, different type of approach to data. You need to have different metrics. So we have a pretty good sense for when you can apply a CPA and an ROI objective, and when you really need to switch to a reach frequency and an awareness or a brand metric objective. And I think that's key, knowing how much good DR data you have and how much awareness data we have. Now, with that said, for our biggest advertisers, we're obviously buying both kinds. And when we look at the individuals that we've cultivated at the top of the funnel with our brand messaging, and as they go through the middle of the funnel and through the conversion, those individuals convert at a higher rate. So we've actually mapped that out, and we've looked at attribution, and we know that approach works.
And we're going to talk about the whole DMP concept a little later, and this concept of sort of a user level, the universal view of a user and stuff. So I want to come back to that because I think that's really important as we're talking about all of this data. But before we get there, let's talk a little more about first-party data now. It sounds to me like we can agree that there are instances where there is value in using third-party data. There are instances when there is not value in using third-party data. Depends on objectives, depends on cost, depends on the sort of rigor behind the development of the segments. Probably none of us can argue that the best data that's available to a client is that client's own data, right? And that can take many forms, right? That can take the form of site-side collected data, that could take the form of, obviously media data, could take the form of offline data. So can we talk about that a little bit? I'm sure you guys, especially all as analytics people, and knowing Emily quite well, as a very analytically minded marketer, are really embracing this concept. But what's happening? What are you doing with it? What's happening for anybody?
So as an analyst, my knee-jerk reaction is to always get as much data as possible. But when you're talking about first-party data, particularly if you want to connect it to third-party data or to behaviors online that are not in an own channel, you start to talk about issues of privacy. And you start to talk about people's comfort level. But I do think that our leading clients, and they're mostly in the retail space, are mining their loyalty data and their transactional data and marrying that with site and off-site behavioral data to great effect. And in particular, where they're finding a lot of potential in this is in keeping the conversation going, and it relates back to this topic of marketing throughout the funnel. Once you've identified those people and you have the first-party data, you can deliver more relevant experiences, content, offers to them throughout the funnel that makes sense in their context. And that's where I think first-party data provides that linkage, because it gives you a knowledge of who that customer is to you, both from a value perspective, a product interest perspective, and sort of a general psychographic perspective.
But, okay, so that's probably like the calculus level answer, right? So like, what's the freshman seminar answer? Like, do you just start by remarketing in more sophisticated ways by doing better segmentation? Like, where do you start? What's the first thing you should do?
I think the segmentation is definitely key, but just remember you're using your first-party data to use for inclusion or exclusion of where you're actually targeting. If you get all the third-party data in the world, that's not necessarily something that's keen directly to your business. And when you gather first-party data, then you're looking at your third-party data to decide what of this third-party data am I going to use. You can start to narrow the funnel. And that's really how you can be more successful, because when you're operating off of just third-party data, you have a very giant collective of information and people that you're putting into your process funnel. But once you have your first-party data to decide what is actually working, then you go back to your third-party data and you start refining. You start refining your audience. You start refining your segments, your marketing, even your creative at that point, and that can be really useful.
Yeah, I would tend to say the same, and the easy place to start I always tend to find is, starting in media is often, I think, some of the easiest places to begin, for a number of reasons. One, because you have volume, you can do test and control and target. You're not hampered by a lot of IT teams or a lot of privacy concerns from legal teams off the start because you weren't collecting PII for the most part to begin with. Secondly, when we talk about segments, I'm not sure that segments in some respects, it's great for, as we begin the upfront process in terms of qualitative and thinking about strategies and personas and how we go to market with the brand. But I'm not sure that when we think about online targeting and advertising, I'm entirely sold off on the idea of segments. I'm a segment of one when I'm looking for a particular watch and I'm on overstock, right? And you want to retarget me in this space, right? But, Jason or Eugene or, we're not the same, we may be in the same segment as you segment us because, mentally we can think in sizes of 3 to 12, but I think we need to think more in terms of specific
Emily
targeting.
probably has good perspective on this because for somebody like Kayak, right? I mean, every user you treat differently because every user has very specific needs.
Well, I think for us, our business is our website. So we don't have a store per se, and we're not really selling products. So for us, our users are defined by their activity on Kayak, essentially. We don't conduct transactions for flights, so we're not even going through to conversion. So I think when you get into the early steps with what do you do with your first party data, I think one of the first things is to take a really good look at what data you have, and think about potentially how you can use it. Because I think for both companies that are just contained as a website or retailers, for instance, that have stores, there's so much data out there, and I think the first step is really identifying what can you use and how can you use it. I think for retailers, they have the website, which can feed in information that can help them to figure out, do they want to connect that to their transactions in stores, or they might just say, look, this information that we have about how people transact on our website is an interesting enough pool that we're going to start there. Or do you have web sign up for an email list or a downloaded coupon, for instance? And each of those pieces of data, as you attach them to a user, has a value. And I think as you get into the automated buying space as well, as you start to identify what is the value of the activity as opposed to necessarily the user, it allows you to segment in a different fashion. So I think the traditional segments for buying, if you're looking at women aged 25 to 30, for instance, it's a different segment than the person who's mid-funnel, for instance. So I think about segments more as where are they in their activity and their response rate, as opposed to what do they look like from a demographic.
Well, that's a great point. When you were saying that, I was thinking, I don't know what he's talking about. Segments are great, but it's because there's a very traditional definition of segment that maybe doesn't necessarily apply in this case, right? Like the segment, in my mind, could be, a segment of one, right? User performs this behavior on my website. I use a dynamic creative optimization company to retarget that user with exactly what they want, right? Versus I only want women 35 to 54.
Well, what about other marketing channels, though, too? That could be a segment in and of itself. How is your site performing on your SEM campaigns or your SEO campaigns? You can actually try to figure out what that user is just by their behaviors and the keywords that they're typing directly into your site. You could use that as a segment to then drive your strategy on how you're going to target your audience once you have those audience behaviors in your cycle.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny, I always feel like one of the biggest challenges that we have as an industry still is that terms are very loaded, and I think a term like segment means 100 different things to 100 different people, and to a media planner and buyer, former, recovered, versus analytics folks, versus a marketer in the digital space, versus a marketer in the traditional space, versus a CRM guy, right? I think we all think about these things in very different ways, and one of the hardest things that we face is trying to talk to each other about this stuff. And so I think where it's getting really interesting and exciting is we're actually starting as an industry to all get in the same room. where you have the CRM guy, you have the VP of analytics, you have the digital marketing person, you know, you have those people getting in a room together and going, oh, you meant that. I thought you meant something completely different. That's just a sort of general comment, that it's something I've experienced.
And kind of what, around that term, and not to get off on it, but part of the reason why I talk about segments the way I do is because often we've used it as a simplification term, right? Like I can't go to the creative team and tell them I want them to make, in a traditional, space 2 or 3 years ago, I can't go to them and talk to them about dynamic advertising. The strategy team tells me it's off-brand. The creative team tells me I'm not going to have a front-end developer create 132 iterations of that ad. But we're not in that space anymore. And we have much more, that's years ago. We have much more capabilities for dynamic bidding, for dynamic targeting, for dynamic placement of advertising. You can work with companies like Xaxis to determine when to turn on and off in specific, spaces and areas for that particular person, right? I mean, you can target me when I'm in specific contexts and not in others. And so I think we're in a different phase of how we're using data and information now. That's not quite as, it's still constrained, but it's not quite as constrained by my pejorative view of sort of segmentation from the past.
I hear you.
Yeah. And I think what I see happening, having spent a few years at McKenna and MRM, I actually see the switch happening from the creative and the planning departments driving the creative to the data. Because if you're trying to drive response, we see the data that works. We know the audiences that work, and we have better information than the market research folk out there and the CRM folk out there. And I'm saying that having kind of spent time in both of those sectors. Literally, we have access to tens of thousands of segments, and we can see which of those segments are converting. And for us to do that, somebody pushes a button, somebody has to kind of scan a report and figure out what's going on. So I think that data is going to start driving creative, and as data drives creative, I think the paradigm will shift from discrete targets to continuous targets. How do you plan your creative around a campaign where you are doing dynamic creative across 57,000 SKUs for a retailer? We do that. That's a very practical challenge. How do you do that when you have a retargeting matrix that's several dozen cells deep, and it's a simple matrix, right? How do you do that when the bulk of your targeting comes from custom models, which is essentially it's a continuum of propensity. It's not a target, and people could look very different. So I think these considerations really have the chance to fundamentally impact how the business of online creative and strategic planning happens.
I'm going to disagree a little bit with Eugene, because the people, we all generate data as we work digitally, as we work in the real world. That's true. Data can tell us what creative works, but the data is not us. And we're inherently emotional creatures, and where I think creative is still going to play a critical role, and maybe even a defining role in the strategy, is what are the emotional components of a brand's strategy, what are the emotional components of a campaign that can get utilized by this system of data and analysis to drive behavior. But without that emotional content, the data is never going to tell you that, at least not over the next couple of years. It's not going to say, here's the emotional content you need to generate behavior in this person.
I agree with you to some extent, but I actually think that the industry right now has not realized the full power and potential in terms of using the data, just the sheer value metrics of it to get at the emotional content. Not saying that there's not a role for strategic planning and market research and creative. I think that is very important, but I think that the balance in terms of front end and back end will start to shift a little bit.
Have you guys heard of TrueView, this YouTube program?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of that's a very interesting, I think, model in some ways. I think so basically with TrueView, the marketer is only, or advertiser is only paying if a user chooses to watch the full ad on YouTube. And when I first heard about it, I thought, I kind of don't, there's something yucky about pay for performance. I don't know why, I just have this kind of gut reaction to it. But then the guy I was listening to speak, his name's Lucas Watson, he's running sales for YouTube, convinced me, because what he said is, really what we want to do is do a much, much better job of matching the user's interest to the ad that we put in front of them. And the better we are at that, the more money we're going to make as a company, the better the user experience is going to be. And I just thought that was such a fantastic way to think about it.
I would say one of the problems we've had with that in the past, from my perspective, and everybody else can chime in, one of the problems we've had with that in the past, I think, from just an agency side, is who gets credit for improved creative? Because in those models, typically, it's not the advertiser, it's the publisher. if I have poor creative, I get 1 million views because I'm paying $1,000 to drive X number of total views. So I don't want my creative to be too good, because then I only get 1,000 views for $1,000. If my creative's fairly poor, I get 1 million views for $1,000 and I get more brand exposure. So I mean, you don't want bad brand exposure, but as we do creative optimization, you want to make sure that your client's getting, value for that.
Well, so just coming from, we're not working with an agency on our online creative, and currently, actually, I'd say probably 95% of the creative that we run, I don't know if you've come across it, is all dynamic creative, and it's all fed by data. And I think, Joanna, to your point, what we found pretty early on was that the response rates actually improved as we used the dynamic creative and started to couple that with different targeting tactics. And part of the reason for that, and a lot of the feedback that we got from various sources, was that people have said, we don't feel that these are actually ads. We're not annoyed. We see your ads everywhere, but they're actually not that annoying because they've just pointed out a hotel that I'm actually really interested in traveling to, and it was very relevant, and it kind of blended in. And I think also to the brand point, we try really hard not to segment, is this a brand ad or is it a direct response ad? Because when it comes down to it, the user or the customer who's viewing the advertisement doesn't know, and they don't care. All they know is that they've seen an advertisement and it has my brand name on it. So we do try to treat everything like a brand piece, and it kind of works in both ways, I'd say.
But there's also the issue of brand exposure versus brand loyalty, and that's going to change your whole creative campaign, because what are you trying to do as a brand? If you're a small brand that no one knows about, then brand exposure is your target, and you have to think about that when you're actually doing your creative. Whereas if you're a well-known brand,
PS, and you're targeting.
And of course. But the brand loyalty segment, that's part of that emotional response and everything. It's how do you grab that customer again, especially when retargeting, because it's a lot cheaper to have a customer purchase again than it is to bring in a new customer.
Totally. I mean, I think we can agree, well, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we can agree that there's a real value in using data to find those users, and then there's a real value in using data to show them the right thing. I mean, that is what it is. I mean, you have to have a great creative concept that's going to connect with them, but you can use data to figure out what they probably want to see. And Emily's doing it in a dynamic way, using a dynamic creative optimization firm. But what it does is it turns that ad almost into content for that user, right?
And I think just to the lift question, I think that who gets credit for making, that kind of resonated with me. Who's going to get credit for making the creative good?
Well, that's a little different, because I'm not talking about dynamic advertising and whether or not you're getting better click-through rates on your specific ad. What I'm talking about is things like TrueView. That's not a dynamic ad.
Right.
That's that's video content, which is not dynamically delivered or served. So I'm talking about slightly different types of advertising and slightly different publisher pricing models that are based more on sort of, basically guaranteed clicks or guaranteed,
Well, and as I said, I'm not a fan of that just in a vacuum. What I liked about that model is that it's doing a better job of connecting user interest to advertiser message. So in theory, both parties win, right? Because, so he even showed, it was great. He actually showed us an ad, and with the whole audience stood up and he said, I'm going to show you an ad, and if you think it sucks, sit down whenever you want to. And it actually was kind of a great ad. It was like a Hot Wheels ad, but they had like a giant live Hot Wheels doing a trick. And everybody was like, oh, that's so neat. That's so interesting. We actually wanted to watch it, right? So that's great for the Hot Wheels, and that's great for YouTube. So that's the nuance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, all I'm saying, and I'll stop, but all I'm essentially saying is when you run great dynamic ads, why not just do a CPM model? The CPA models at some point, the better your ads get, the better they. I know, that's my point. Oh. My point is you have to really look at the publisher model and how they're getting paid, because as you get better ads, you might want to shift that payment model to something that gives you more reward.
Amen.
You always want great ads. I mean, I'm not up here to say create sucky ads. I'm just basically saying, think about who gets paid for it.
No,
and
amen.
Shift your model to that.
So let's talk about managing all of this data now. What systems you use to manage all of this data, to bring this together, right? It's really easy to say, oh, we'll use third-party data, we'll use first-party data, we'll match it all up, and we're going to target against the funnel. It's awfully complex. It's awfully complex. So, I mean, are you guys, talk to me about this concept of the data management platform. talk to me about how you define it, because I have a feeling everyone defines it slightly differently, and why you do or don't think that it's valuable, and how, if at all, you're using it. And that's for anybody.
So I'll start because Xaxis is actually the only kind of buy-side entity to operate a data management platform. I think we built it about 4 years ago. And I think what's really interesting is you look at the concept of DMP, there are different definitions. If you are a data seller and you sell data, just your own data, a lot of companies say, well, we have our data management platform, and because the term is undefined, yes, you do. Then there are players that are more aggregators, and they say, well, look, data management platform means that we have a whole lot of segments. And that strikes me as a richer definition of a DMP. We actually define DMP differently than I think the bulk of the industry. We believe that the key to DMP is universality. If it's going to be your brain, the brain needs to be able to see everything. So what that means for us, it means all data and access to all media. So for example, if you're BlueKai, and BlueKai has a leading DMP, but there are data providers that will not put their data into BlueKai. We have all of that data. So that means that we have more data points to define a really good audience. And in fact, we have access to all the data in our platform. And the media side, I think, is equally important, because if you look at a third-party DSP, typically they have access to all of their RTB inventory, but they will not have access to all of the ad network and publisher inventory. We do, because we're in a buy side. Our tags kind of go universally, so we have more places to find those audiences. So if you have 1,000 super valuable people in your retargeting pool, we will be able to serve more impressions to them, at least 2x more, by coupling more media. So for us, a DMP is a universal construct that sucks in all the third-party data, all the first-party data, and allows us to access those audiences across the full range of media, including real-time bidded and reserved media.
So Eugene,
Eugene,
you're not, just to correct me if I'm wrong, you're not suggesting that you take first-party data from clients and apply that to other clients' business, right? You're keeping a
No,
wall.
not at all.
Okay.
All the data is sequestered by client. Actually, in Europe, we do operate a data co-op.
It's like an opt-in kind of thing?
It's a fully opt-in thing, and it's opt-in across advertisers and publishers. It's a very different model. In the U.S., all the data is segregated.
So Eugene, is it as simple as having a universal tag? I mean, is that the foundation of a DMP, is having a tag that goes everywhere?
Well, I mean that's one thing. I mean, there's a lot of systems, both for the actual data management platform as well as execution systems, analytics. But also it's about who you are in the ecosystem, right? So if you are a third-party DSP, the technology stack, is different. Let's assume it's the same. You're still gonna have trouble getting your tags on Yahoo's homepage or across a buyonad.com. We don't have that issue because we have a buy-side technology. We're not perceived as competing with Yahoo or with ad.com.
So it's not a tech problem per se, it's a business problem? People will say no to accepting that tag?
I mean, that is the case now, and my sense is that a lot of the third-party DSPs are in the process of looking for ways to access more inventory.
So I know, Emily, you have I hope you don't mind me saying this, you have a great relationship with MediaMath as a DSP who has DMP capabilities, or so they say, not that I don't believe it, but I haven't looked too deeply into it. I mean, a partner like that, how does that work? Are you applying them to more than just your biddable media? Are you using them as a data collector?
I mean,
what does that look like?
For us, I think that the primary use of the data really comes from our first-party data. And as we test third-party data, one of the conversations that we often have is how does this affect the other data that we're using? Are we seeing overlap? Who are these data sources? So some of it's even the vetting of the data and the knowledge of the data and the sources and how it's coming from.
And do you use MediaMath's tag to be able to do that? Or do you have a hodgepodge?
It's a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of how we're using the data, and some of it really depends on the partner and how we're working with the partner in various instances. And so I think something we're careful of is if we're going to buy data, do we have other relationships with the person who is selling that data as well? Okay. Making sure that we're not crossing over ourselves, not buying data that we already have. And we work with MediaMath on that as a vetting process.
Okay.
And they also have data that's integrated into their platform as well. And so we leverage the data that comes along.
Right,
with
that's
being-
already there.
It's already there.
Yeah. So for you guys, I mean, do you think that there is a DMP out there that's really doing what we, in my mind, I want a DMP to be, which is kind of this central repository for all kinds of streams of digital data? It has normalization, it has segment building capabilities, it has some kind of decisioning, some kind of brain, and then allows you to push out into whatever live channel you want. I mean, that's my dream, but does that exist?
I mean, that's kind of what we have. I mean, we're
Well, I know
we're
you
continuously
guys.
working
Okay,
on it.
you yes. And so Eugene, you probably haven't then gone out and been like, you didn't need to do a formal Blue Kai versus Demdex versus, or maybe you did and you said they're all lacking and we're going to build our own. But for these guys who maybe haven't done that or have chosen because for whatever reason they're not in the technology building business.
Well, there are some customizable solutions out there, like Cervelo. Like it allows you to be able to almost whitelist the actual data collection service that you have and use it for your particular needs. Because a lot of the DMPs out there that are coming pre-built don't necessarily quite service what you're after, especially from the agency side.
Like what?
Well, just in general, the data collection, it's more the way that it's segmenting the data and the customization of how you're correlating third-party data to first-party data.
All right, so not the collection, but what you can do with it?
Yeah, what you can do with it. It's creating custom correlations of data so that you can then use that data to your for your strategy, basically.
And I guess I would build on what Toby just said and say that at Razorfish we're helping a lot of our leading clients, probably a half a dozen at this point, build their own private DMPs for precisely that reason, because the publicly available ones that you can buy off the shelf are not meeting their specific business needs.
And
Sometimes there's too much in them.
Exactly.
That's the
Yep.
major problem.
What are the core components that you need to be able to do that?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, you need to have, Eugene talked about the technology stack. You have to have the right technology, and often today that's a cloud-based technology. You have to have the right data architecture. You have to have access to the right tools, things like Hadoop and MapReduce, and know how to use those to stitch all of the data together. And then I would build on what Emily said, it's starting with your first-party data. So it's gathering all of the first-party data inside your organization together in one spot, and then adding in the third-party data that you need that makes sense. And do that on a test basis, so test your way to successful inclusion of additional third-party data.
And not all the first-party data can always be integrated into these systems.
Exactly.
And that's the biggest
The existing
flaw.
systems.
Yeah, the existing systems. You can't, if all of a sudden a new tool set comes out where you can bring in another set of first-party data, there's a new tag or something that comes out that's actually giving you a segment of data, you can't always then bring that into your system and then start correlating that with your other data.
I actually am a big doubter of the movement that's happening across the ecosystem to actually build proprietary DMPs client by client. The technology is so new, it's so complicated, there's just not enough people that know what's going on, and it keeps changing, that the idea of building a DMP for a large kind of business versus for a platform, I think the investment profiles are so different. I mean, we're working on these investments right now, and it's really challenging stuff. So I really think it's too early for clients to invest in proprietary solutions, because I think that technology landscape is too complex and changing too fast.
Yeah, but Eugene, that same thing applies to your business model as well. Because it's moving so complex and so fast, you can't say that a third-party DMP provider is necessarily the solution either, right? And I'm not suggesting that all of these large corporations or client organizations would build those DMPs inside their IT firewalls and use the traditional sort of waterfall process and take 18 months to get it built. I think there are quick ways to get something up and running that service a tactical need. And look, I'm a veteran of the CRM wars of the early 90s, when a lot of organizations were sold on this idea, if you build a multi-million-dollar integrated consumer database, your business will be transformed. They invested a lot of money in those data systems, and their business wasn't transformed because they didn't think first about the application of that data. And I think that's the thing that you put first, and a lot of our clients have looked at that and said, hey, based on our specific needs, we can get a solution that fits our needs today, that we can build on for tomorrow. It's not going to cost us every penny we have in our purse strings, and we'll get good results from that.
And that's often smaller scale, too.
Exactly.
These are huge scale components in these DMPs, and it's not what we need right now. Like, I'd be looking for something that's a lot smaller scale to just fit the KPIs and the needs that I have within that system.
We could talk about this for days. I love this stuff. But I have a feeling we have to stop, Steve, right? And maybe let these guys ask some questions.
Hey guys, great job today. Lawrence DeCapua from GE. Question for you about social data. So, I think this is an area that's really changing radically, very quickly over the last several years. Be very curious to understand how you're using or how you'd recommend using social data to better understand customers and leads and to better target and reach them.
For me, I have been using Radian 6, has a lot of flaws, a lot of limitations, especially because of spam that's out there. There's so much noise in the data that's coming in through a wrap lead for a Radian 6 just because there's so many scrapers and spam blogs out there that you really can't, you have to really go through a bit of a manual process to weed out a lot of that data and get the accurate stats that you actually need. What I get really impressed with is when I find social services that actually have a backlog of data. So a lot of times when you sign up for a lot of the fire hose of data within these social areas, you end up with, okay, starting now, we're going to collect your data, and you don't have a foot to stand on at that point. So really, when you're looking for a social platform to bring in a lot of this data, start to pay more attention as to what their backlog is and how you can actually access that, because it almost is like using third-party data at that point.
Hi, this is Vidya from GenRain. I wanted to build up on that question. So when we talk about social data, people are usually talking about intention data. So when you talk about Radian 6, it's more about what people are saying about your brand on a social network. What about the social data that is being collected by brands through site registration, for instance? People are deploying social login on their site, and with that comes a rich set of profile information about the user and their declared interests. So what are brands doing there, and what are you guys recommending?
Well, there was a great technology out there called Hunch, which actually would access your registration list, social profiles, and then figure out what that audience segment was based on their tweets, their followers, and an extended network into like their actual Facebook. Brilliant technology. It got bought by eBay. So unfortunately, it's a technology where their API is actually still available. And if you have a good set of developers that can utilize their API to go through this, you can actually set it up pretty nicely to look at your audience segment through their social profiles.
And something was made, a comment earlier I just would add up, I think, as we're closing, which is a lot around loyalty campaigns and programs. So we basically used a lot of that information towards creating loyalty groups and user groups that are key influencers and to get sort of that response loop back. So I mean, the information's still very sparse. I mean, the whole point, a lot of that registration and login information, all the kinds of social information you get isn't at scale to really drive, significant marketing spend. It's more around creating intensity within a user group. So that's how we've been using it.
You'll just have to talk to Jen, Ryan.
How about mobile? Let me add into the mix mobile, since I'm the mobile guy. Let me ask where we are in terms of what mobile can deliver or what you're expecting mobile as a data layer to deliver that you're not getting.
Hard.
We're doing tests with a lot of clients. We have a ton of clients at Razorfish that view their marketing as omnichannel. So they're looking at mobile as one of many places where their advertising needs to live. And we're doing a lot of testing with, like Blue Kava is probably the leading provider of that, to see how you can track data across the platforms and the vendors. And a lot of brands are doing that because they see coming what everybody sees coming, especially you as the mobile guy, which is mobile is going to be where everything is in 5 years, and so we need to solve that. And
Yeah,
so
I mean,
there's a lot of
essentially moving
experimentation
beyond
going
the
on.
limitations
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
cookie when we talk about
Yes.
multi-channel. I like omni-channel, by the way. I might start using that.
You need to give me credit if you do, John.
Jason Lay of Razorfish.
Yeah, our
Thanks.
issue with that too is that it's getting lumped in with mobile. Our media buys are just one package as opposed to looking at it as two separate entities, and that's something that's been very challenging for us lately.
Although mobile's going to deliver a kind of data path or a really granular path of data and understanding where, not only where people are, but in what order they're engaging.
If we can actually figure out how to track the path.
Right.
I mean, our system tracks mobile exactly the same way that it tracks all of our online interactions. So we can do pathing. It's just that the pathing for mobile and the pathing for everything else online, they're different cookies. So the cookies don't line up, and nobody's figured out a way to match those things up without violating privacy. So I think the fundamentals of managing mobile actually, I mean, they're strategically different. The underlying technology is not, and we've been able to make our technology work for that. But I think the idea of marrying the cookies is, I think it's a big industry challenge.
Maybe we should have a mobile data panel next time.
Thank you for the idea, then. I'm the guy who does that. Joanna, panel, thank you very much for a great start.
Guys.
We are, and of course, not only